Welcome to our program entitled Creating Monarch Habitats for Schools and Communities. This is Dr. Marcia Anderson with the EPA's Center for Integrated Pest Management, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator. This webinar is produced by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Center for Integrated Pest Management. The views expressed by our presenters are for educational purposes only and do not represent the official views or positions of the EPA or the presenters' organizations. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Chip Taylor. He's professor emeritus at University of Kansas and the founder and director of Monarch Watch. Dr. Taylor serves on the steering committee of several key monarch-related organizations. In addition, he has received prestigious awards from the National Resource Defense Council and North American Pollinator Protection Campaign for his work on monarch conservation. Next, we have Dr. Karen Oberhauser. She's the director of the Arboretum at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She works with teachers, the public, and students using monarchs to teach biology, conservation, and the process of science. Dr. Oberhauser started the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, which engages hundreds of volunteers throughout North America and helps oversee the Journey North program, which tracks monarch movement and distribution during spring and fall migration. And we have Dr. Amanda Pierce. She's a biologist for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Pierce specializes in risk assessment and regulatory policy related to emerging technologies. Prior to her work at EPA, she earned her doctorate in ecology and evolution at Emory University, researching monarch butterfly population structure and migration. And now, Dr. Amanda Pierce will start us off.
All right, thanks, Marcia. So as she said, I'm Amanda Pierce and a biologist here at EPA. But before my work at EPA, I was a researcher looking at different monarch butterfly populations. So I'll be talking to you about both of these subjects. Today, I wanted to briefly discuss some facts about monarch butterflies and their migration, as well as discuss threats that are impacting that migration. And finally, I wanted to talk about a few different ways that you as an individual can help. So monarch butterflies are famous for their annual migration that occurs each fall. Millions of monarch butterflies make the journey from northern parts of the United States and southern Canada down to overwintering sites in Mexico. And here at these overwintering sites, they cluster together in the mountain hillside Oyamel fir forests. So you can see a bit in this video here, just some examples of monarchs at their overwintering site. So one of the facts that I find most amazing about monarch butterflies is that their ability to migrate is truly innate, meaning it's hardwired within themselves. Each monarch butterfly that reaches their overwintering site is actually on its maiden journey and has never been to that site before. In the summer, monarchs live in breeding grounds found in the central and northern United States and southern Canada, and a few generations separate each migration event. In the fall, monarchs begin their journey south for the winter, and then once spring arrives, monarchs travel back to the breeding grounds, with multiple generations taking place along the way. So on the left here is a picture that I really like. It's an image of a tree at the overwintering site, and the tree in the background looks like maybe kind of a fuzzy picture, but in actuality, that tree is just covered in thousands of monarchs, like absolutely covered so the branches are weighing down. But in addition to these monarch butterflies, which travel to Mexico each winter, there's actually a second group of migratory monarchs that live in the United States. And these monarch butterflies live west of the Rocky Mountains and they migrate to the California coast. So their overwintering habitat differs slightly in terms of the trees that they cluster in, a picture of which is over here on the right. And then aside from these two migratory monarch groups, there are actually other monarch butterflies that live year-round within the United States. Some of those can be found in South Florida near Miami, and those monarchs actually don't migrate. And then in addition to these different groups of mainland US monarchs, there are other non-migratory monarch butterflies that live in Hawaii and other places around the globe. But for today, we're mainly going to focus, at least in my talk, on these migratory monarchs and the decline that we're seeing in their populations. So the eastern monarch butterfly population size is typically estimated by the number of hectares being occupied at the overwintering site, so the amount of area where you can find them down in Mexico. So as you can see on this graph, there's a downward trend in terms of the amount of area monarchs are occupying at the Mexican overwintering sites. And this downward trend is indicative of a decline in the population size. Now, this trend is even more dramatic for Western monarchs. And so we've seen drastic reductions in the last couple of years in population counts that have occurred at the California overwintering sites, where they've estimated that the California population is roughly 29,000 monarchs. And while 29,000 might sound like a large number, compare this to numbers from counts that were found in the 1980s when the population was estimated to actually be in the millions. So we can see that that's actually quite a dramatic decline. So the question we have to ask ourselves when we see this reduction in the population in the eastern group and the same reduction in the western group is, why is this decline happening and what can we do to try and prevent it? Unfortunately, like most things in life, the answer is it's complicated. So monarch butterflies have to overcome a number of hurdles to complete their migration, and each of these different obstacles play a role in the decline of monarch butterfly populations. So here, this comic is asking why monarch migration isn't considered an Olympic sport. And that's not only because of the long distance, where some butterflies are traveling thousands of miles to reach their overwintering sites, but it's also because of all of these different hurdles that they face along the way, like severe weather, reduced breeding grounds, and deforestation. So I'm going to briefly go through each of these different threats that monarchs face. So the comic referenced severe weather, and that is something that monarchs face both on the way to the overwintering sites, while at the overwintering sites, and even on their way back to summer breeding grounds. And monarchs face challenging weather conditions throughout the entire journey, and these conditions can also drastically change from year to year, resulting in fluctuations in their population size. So for example, here we have a photograph of the same field in Texas from 2 different years. And one of the pictures here on the left is from April 2010. So in the spring, and here we can see that the field is green, there's wildflowers, there's the potential for milkweed, which is the food plant that caterpillars need to eat. And all of these resources act as potential nectaring sources or larval food plants for monarchs. But then we compare that to the picture on the right, the same field the very next year and a similar time, and now we see that a major drought has hit the region. And you can see that the field is mostly barren. And so now those flowering plants are gone. That removes that nectaring energy source for monarchs. The possible milkweed is gone. That removes the larval breeding plants that are around. And all of these are crucial resources that monarchs need as they make their journey back north to additional breeding grounds. So here we see a photo, even if a monarch butterfly is capable of making this arduous journey to their overwintering sites in Mexico, they're still not home free. So in addition to weather hazards that are going along their route for the migration or the remigration, there can also be winter storms at the overwintering site itself, which can be a big problem for monarchs. So the OML fir forests in Mexico, where the monarchs overwinter, provides an ideal microclimate where weather is typically stable and a good humidity level for monarchs to be able to survive for months at a time over the winter. And when weather deviates significantly from that climate, it can have severe negative impacts on monarch butterfly populations. So low temperatures can have an obvious negative impacts on monarchs like freezing, like as what you see in this photo, but other temperature deviations can also result in monarchs needing to use up their fat reserves, which just takes away energy that they would otherwise have needed to travel back north after the winter. So as I mentioned before, the OML fir forests in Mexico provide an ideal microclimate for monarch butterflies to overwinter in. Unfortunately, illegal logging and forest deforestation has significantly reduced the area of winter habitat for monarchs. Here you can see images over almost 30 years from 1971 to 1999, where the amount of gray and yellow that you see in these images is increasing over time, and those colors indicate partly cleared or fully cleared forest. And you can see in these images, there's some small red dots, and those are actually overwintering sites of monarchs. And you can see compared to 1971, once you get to 1999, there are even some red dots within these grayed areas, indicating that that's likely not suitable overwintering habitat for monarchs anymore. Now, a lot of effort has gone into trying to prevent and reduce forest degradation, with success seen in a reduction of illegal logging, but a lot of additional work is still necessary to protect these overwintering sites. So I just wanted to briefly remind you of the migration flight paths and timings, because that's going to become important with some of the recommendations that we'll talk about near the end of my talk at least. So we know in the fall, monarchs migrate down to the overwintering site in Mexico. But in the spring, they travel back up through the south to breeding grounds, like through Texas with those pictures I showed you. And then in the summer, monarchs will continue to additional breeding grounds found in the more northern parts of the US. And so the timing of where monarchs are in the United States throughout the year and what types of resources are critical to monarch biology during that part of the year is going to be important in conservation planning. And so then that brings us to a couple of the other issues impacting monarch butterflies, which is the loss of milkweed in the breeding grounds. So during the spring and summer, monarchs are especially in need of milkweed plants, as like I mentioned, this is the food that monarch caterpillars eat. I believe you'll hear a lot about the types of milkweeds and native milkweeds that should be planted in different regions in later talks today. But in terms of monarch population decline, one risk factor is the loss of milkweed in the breeding ground. And this can come from land being used for other purposes and from mowing and pesticide applications. So I'll be discussing some recommendations for how to prevent milkweed loss in the next couple of slides. So similarly, it's also believed that the loss of flowering plants along the migration route in the fall have also contributed to monarch butterfly decline. And this is because these flowering plants provide the energy that monarchs need to make their long distance journey south. And so by having less of these plants, that means less food and less energy resources for monarchs to use to be able to actually make that long journey. So the recommendations that I'll be discussing will also apply to these flowering plants. Now, I'm sure you'll hear in other talks today about additional ways in which you can do things to protect monarch butterflies, but because I work for the Office of Pesticide Programs, I'm going to focus on pesticides. So EPA we regulate pesticides, and we also recognize that herbicides are an important tool that people need to use to control weeds. However, at the same time, EPA is committed to protecting pollinators, and that of course includes the monarch butterfly. So we've been focusing conservation efforts on monarchs in 4 different areas. So there's pesticide label language. So as anyone who uses a pesticide should know, the label is the law, and following label instructions is critical to using a pesticide correctly. And to further reduce pesticide exposure to pollinator or monarch habitat, in 2017, EPA updated the label language for pesticide products that are toxic to plants. And this label language raises awareness of potential effects to pollinator habitat and directs the user to instructions on minimizing spray drift. So minimizing the likelihood that you're accidentally having an application hit milkweed plants, for example. There's also cooperative efforts between the EPA and other stakeholders, as well as education and outreach, similar to today's webinar, but also other webinars that are focused on spray drift and other best management practices. And then, of course, for any pesticide that's registered, EPA is conducting a science and risk assessment to take into account pollinator and non-target plants. So specifically, things that people can do to protect monarch butterfly habitat when it comes to herbicides is to use herbicides efficiently and effectively. And what we mean by that is use a selective herbicide, so an herbicide that's actually just targeting the weed that it is you're interested in, or if you're using a non-selective, more broad herbicide, to use that in a selective manner to reduce the potential impact on milkweed plants. And then, as I said before, of course, follow label directions. So avoiding damage to non-target plants like milkweed or native flowering plants, you can work on doing spot treatments rather than broad sprays, and take note of weather conditions like wind speeds. That's all going to help reduce potential spray drift from occurring. And then we also want to do our part to reduce herbicide exposure to monarchs. And so one way to do that is to treat weeds before they flower, so before they become that kind of a nectar resource for monarchs to visit. And then you can also adjust the timing of applications. So similar to how I mentioned how it's important to be aware of where monarchs are in the country and what resources they're using at that time. If you want to time your applications to coincide with their behavior when they're not in the area, then that can also be useful. And these same types of practices can also apply to mowing. So there's different ways that you can adjust mowing practices to benefit monarch butterflies. So first, you can reduce the frequency of mowing and also avoid mowing the entire habitat, so leaving some native plants or milkweed or whatnot around still. And then also adjust the timing of mowing. So again, when monarchs are not going to necessarily be utilizing these resources, or after native plants have already finished blooming and dispersing seeds. And then finally, there's additional mowing techniques that can be implemented, like spot mowing or adjusting the mowing height to 10 to 12 inches. And that recommendation is made because it's believed that this height effectively removes the seed producing parts of most invasive plants while still minimizing wildlife impact. And here on my last slide, I believe Marcia said that this is available in the handout. There's some links here where you can get additional information and see more local specific timing recommendations for protecting monarchs and pollinators. Thank you.
And thank you, Amanda, for your comprehensive introduction to monarchs, their migration, habits, and habitats. Now we're going to have Dr. Chip Taylor. He'll follow with the creation, conservation, and protection of monarch habitats. Chip, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here today to talk to you about creating habitats for monarch butterflies. We've been in this game for a while at Monarch Watch, and so I'm going to talk to you about the title here, Creating Monarch Habitats for Schools and Communities, because this is something we've been doing since 2005. We started a program called Monarch Way Stations, where we create, conserve, and protect monarch habitats. And that's our sign, and we have that sign displayed proudly across the United States and Canada and about 5 countries around the world. The idea of this sign is to convince people that we have a conservation issue here, and we need to pay attention to the resources that support the things that connect everything in the system. Monarch butterflies are connected with a lot of plants. The pollinators in general out there are connected with a lot of plants. They provide the services that plants need to successfully produce the seeds and roots and shoots and everything else that everything else depends on. So it's connectivity that we're promoting here with this Monarch Way Station sign, connectivity for monarchs, connectivity for pollinators, and connectivity for all the ecosystem services that are associated with pollinators. We started this program, as I said, in 2005. We now have something like 27,000 registered sites. Since a lot of people don't register their sites, we're estimating that about 50,000 sites have been created. And a survey shows that about 51% 90% of those sites are at homes, but about 10% of those are also in schools. And that means of our 27,000 that we have, over 2,700 in schools around the country. That's a considerable number, but we're still working on increasing that number. The Monarch way stations are distributed across 49 states and District of Columbia. We have 6 Canadian provinces involved with over 1,000 Monarch way stations. So we're reaching out and we're engaging a lot of people over a lot of areas, including about 5 different countries around the world, including even India. So the idea of conserving and connecting the habitats for basic pollinator services is important. And even though we talk about monarchs in this country, the idea that this needs to be done everywhere is being spread around the world. All right, showing you the distribution. We have distributions where we have a lot of concern about monarch butterflies. Wisconsin's really good with over 1,000. Michigan's even better with 2,000. And Texas is the leader right now with 2,200. California is doing really well. So you can see where monarchs are of great concern to people. We have a lot of involvement. And so right down through the center part of the country and through the Northeast is where we have a lot of people engaged in monarch conservation. This is primarily an activity of people who live in and around cities. It's a suburban and urban sort of activity. You can see these clusters around major metropolitan areas. You go to Minnesota, you see the big cluster around Minneapolis, St. Paul. You can see Dallas and Austin represented there, Houston, San Antonio, and so on and so forth. So this appeals to a lot of people who have backyard possibilities where they can use their backyards to create habitats. It's also where all our schools are located that we're engaged with as well. The idea here is to create a friendly habitat, a habitat that will engage a lot of pollinators, including monarch butterflies. These are monarchs that showed up in our monarch way station, which was the first image I showed. This is a flower that we have in it that attracts a tremendous number of monarchs at the very end of the migration. This is the Tartarian aster, and it's a very, very good pollinator plant. It's not native, unfortunately, but as a garden plant, this is one of the best that you can possibly use for end of year services for pollinators. The Monarch way stations have a lot of desired features. Let's talk about those so that you can get an idea of what's involved. This is not difficult to create a habitat for monarch butterflies. For our registration procedures, all we need is something about 100 square feet. We need exposure for at least 6 hours a day to full sunlight. The soil should be well drained with very little clay in them. We ask that people plant the plants close together to provide hiding places for the caterpillars. Caterpillars need some protection. They're easily preyed upon by ants and wasps and a whole lot of other things. So we want to give the caterpillars the maximum opportunity to survive. For milkweeds, which are the host plants for the caterpillars, we ask that people use at least 10 plants of 2 or more species of milkweeds. Nectar plants are needed to fuel flight and reproduction, and there are quite a large number of nectar plants that can be used. And the gardens are actually dominated by these pollinator plants, more so than milkweeds, but they are the plants that bring in both the monarchs and the other pollinators. Way station management requires some attention. People have to be aware of the fact that when you're starting a garden, a certain amount of watering is required. We have problems with schools because over the summer, we have to have care during the summer. That means that somebody has to be out there watering those school gardens about once a week. Mulching is usually the necessary thing to start a garden. You may not need to mulch all the time, but starting a garden, mulching is important because it does 2 things. It retains moisture and has the effect of limiting the invasion of other species that are competing for your plants, and that reduces the amount of weeding that you have to do, and weeding is something that will be involved in maintaining one of these gardens. So you have to be attentive to weeding to weed out the things that like to invade, and the seeds that might already be in the soil that you're preparing might come up as unwanted visitors, and you'll have to take care of those. Occasionally, as you develop these gardens, you'll have to do some thinning because things get to be a little bit too robust, and that helps to kind of maintain high diversity. The garden that I showed you in the first picture has about 150 different species of plants in it. It's maintained by the master gardeners in our area, and every year we talk about what's doing well and what isn't doing well. And so managing the garden on a long-term basis requires that you pay attention to how each plant is performing and what needs to be adjusted. Some things don't do well in your environment, other things will need to be brought in, and so on and so forth. So it's a constant sort of experimentation to see what is most effective, and that's all part of the management scheme. Fertilizing, it generally isn't too important for native plants, but occasionally you'll have to bring in fertilizers, and you'll certainly need those for any annuals that you use or any perennials that are not native that require a little bit of fertilization. Now, amending the soil is something people aren't generally familiar with, but you can get your soil tested, determine how acid or basic it is, and that determines a great deal about how successful certain plants will be. Certain plants do not like really acid soils or extremely basic soils. And you're trying to get something that has a more neutral pH or just slightly more acid than the neutral. And to do that, you may have to amend the soil, and there are various ways to do this with various products. Usually you can determine whether you need to amend the soil either by looking at what's not working or getting your soil tested to determine how acid or basic it is. At the end of the season, we recommend removing dead stalks. This opens up the surface a little bit, will allow the plants that are been well established to break through in the spring nicely without having to deal with the dead vegetation. So removing the dead stalks is fairly important, and that can be done at the end of the winter or even in the fall. For more information on how to manage a monarch way station, you can go to our website as indicated there. Nectar plants are important. Monarchs, other butterflies, bees, and other pollinators need nectar to fuel flight and reproduction, as we said earlier, and many bees and beetles use pollen as well. So the challenge is to find the best resources to meet these needs for your area. Most of the nectar and pollen plants are in the sunflower and mint families. That means you can bring in large introduced things like Tithonia, which is the Mexican sunflower. It's an annual, it won't spread, it won't do anything but provide a great nectar source. Various echinaceas, plants in the genus Liatris or plants in the Helianthus family or genera can do really well. And there are a large number of mints that are very excellent plants for pollinators. Mints tend to be more bee-oriented plants than butterfly plants, but butterflies do use quite a few mint species for nectar sources. There are many sources of information available on the internet that are appropriate for your area, wherever it might be. Pollinator Partnership has got a lot of good websites available. We have a lot of plant lists on our website as well. So you can go to our open house, which we have every May, and you can see the list of plants that we provide. And we try to focus very clearly on the best pollinator plants and the best host plants for other butterflies that might be incorporated in any of these gardens. We also engage in a lot of outreach and activities by creating habitats. Here we're creating a habitat along the interstate near Guthrie, Oklahoma. We got the Native Plant Society of Oklahoma involved, and they helped us put in about 2,000 plants in 2 sites on I-35 a couple of years ago, and this was basically an afternoon's work, and it worked out very well. This was kind of an interesting experience because this was, as you see in the background, a grassy area. It was relatively dry. There were no flowers in the area, but as we brought these plants in, the pollinators just came into the flowering plants that we had just sitting in the roadway here before we even got them in the ground. It was an interesting proof of concept because just by bringing the flowers there, the butterflies and the bees all of the native pollinators in the area, just kind of sucked into the resource we brought to the area even before we put them in the ground. So we also have a free milkweeds for schools and nonprofits program. This is funded by National Resource Defense Council. This has helped us a great deal in recent years. So these locations on this map represent more than 34,000 free milkweed plants that have been distributed to over 1,050 schools and nonprofits between 2014 and 2019. And this program continues this year. We have funding to continue to distribute another approximately 200 the plants for another 200 schools. And you can see here the kids get excited when the plants arrive. This is a flat that becomes available. Those look like they're swamp milkweed plants. Kids get excited. Love the expression on that little girl in the red shirt. She's excited, and we get other similar enthusiastic responses by the kids. They're anxious to get outside, anxious to do something that is a little different from the usual school routine, and something that's positive, which is what this program is all about. The plants we distribute are generally 2 to 3 months old, sometimes older. They're well rooted. They have a really good opportunity to get established. Once we get them into these gardens, you can see the swamp milkweed there on the left, the butterfly weed in the center, and the green antelope horn milkweed on the right there. So these are good plants for most of the central part of the United States. Here we have some being planted. I see a mint there in the background. That's going to be bringing in a lot of bees. So somebody's already started a garden here that looks pretty good. And now they've got milkweed. And here we have another school that's planting periphery of the school, put in a fairly big garden. And you can see one of the good things about this is that you can have quite a bit of community outreach. You can have either the teachers or the students talking to the local media about their positive approach to dealing with the environment, which is a really good thing. And here we have more kids putting plants in their ground, and they like it. They feel again that they're doing something positive. It teaches them a little bit of basic husbandry, and they get the sense that they are contributing something valuable to the community. Here we have a nice garden being created. You have some really luscious topsoil being spread in this particular garden, and this is what it looks like after it's already been planted. Now that looks pretty sparse, but those will fill in. If you look closely at that image, you can see that there is a lot of mulch nicely placed around those plants to hold the moisture in and to minimize the growth of invading plants of one sort or another, or even the seeds in the ground. So this is well done. I see some swamp milkweed there on one part. I see some I see a composite. I'm not sure which composite that is, but got a composite which is a yellow flower there that is also a good pollinator plant, a nectar plant for butterflies. So they got a good start there. Let me show you another thing here, and that is that you can often get the parents involved in the kids' activities. These are kind of big kids, right? But they get involved too, and they feel responsible for what's going on. And these are the people that'll help maintain these gardens through the summer months. So you need to have a community that's working here, not just the school teacher, not just the students. You need to get some larger support for most of these programs to keep them viable from year to year. This is a project that we became engaged with a few years ago. This was a former EPA site. This was a former chemical site that was really pretty badly polluted, and the topsoil was taken off, and we wanted to know what to do with it, and we suggested, well, let's create some gardens. And you can see this is the general outline. We had 4 of these plots, and the idea was to create a bee, a butterfly, a bird, and a monarch garden here with 4 of these sites. And the challenge was how to get the plants in the ground. So I called on all of my friends and resources that I could, and we had a planting day. And this planting day involved getting over about 1,100 plants in the ground in a short time. And we got something like 1,100 plants in the ground in something like 55 minutes. It was just amazing. It went a lot faster than I thought. And when we got all done, it looked about like this, which doesn't look like much. And you say, well, what have we done? This isn't really a garden, is it? It isn't really what we wanted, was it? But look at what happened later. As this thing grew out and putting all of those plants in there, we knew what we were doing. We knew how to put those plants in the ground. And we got these great sites established. Less than 1 year later, this is what it all looked like. And you see this sign here. We have a number of signs. We have the Monarch Garden sign. We have a butterfly garden sign that tells people what's involved in the butterfly garden in terms of the plants, the insects, and so on and so forth. We have the bee garden talking about the different species of bees that use these plants and why they use them and why the pollination is important. A lot of did you know stuff. And then the bird garden with its, the monarch or with um, the slogan there, our future flies on the wings of pollinators, which I like because what that speaks to is what I talked about earlier, which is the connectivity that we need to maintain. Well, the ultimate goal is the monarchs and for all the things that we do. And we want to have this is common milkweed and there's a monarch egg on that milkweed. And that's what we want to provide. And here we have more proof of concept. These are milkweeds that were planted in Oklahoma the previous spring. Butterflies came through the following spring and really laid a lot of eggs on those plants. That is not a staged picture. That's exactly what happened. And if you look in the background there, as I can, you can see a lot of plants that were completely stripped there. That's what we want to see. We want to create that habitat. And we want to give the experience of the kids to experience monarch caterpillars, monarch butterflies, and to have that personal contact with these insects, to actually connect what they're doing with the butterflies themselves. There's a caterpillar, there's a butterfly, there's another butterfly. I can see on that one, there's a tag showing through. And to get these kids to put the butterfly on their nose is a fun sort of thing to do because it tickles. And they've got to kind of bite their lip in order to keep the butterfly there because it's not the normal experience, but it is one that they enjoy and it brings joy to everybody else to see this. And we have another program, and I'll just finish up with this very, very quickly. This is our Bring Back to Monarchs program. We realized that monarch way stations were not quite enough, and so we created a larger habitat program. And that program demands that we produce a lot of milkweeds. And since somewhere around 2010, we have distributed over 1 million milkweed plants around the country. We work with 5 nurseries producing tens of thousands of plants each year, usually about 150,000 plants each year, and these plugs are distributed according to where the seeds came from. And that's all that Toto and I have from Kansas, and we thank you for participating, and hopefully at the end I'll be able to answer some of your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chip, for your enlightening presentation and dedication to protecting monarchs and pollinators. Next, we'll have Dr. Karen Oberhauser to brief us on specifics of creating these monarch habitats in our communities and schools. Karen, take it away.
Okay, so now that you've learned everything you need to know about monarchs and monarch conservation and about gardening and what Monarch Watch is doing, I'm going to talk in a little more detail about creating garden habitat for monarchs and other pollinators, and then end with a few tips on how to use this habitat with students. And I just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of this talk I have created in collaboration with my colleague Ilse Gebhardt, who lives in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and who has reared thousands of monarchs and created a lot of monarch habitat in her time. And a lot of the ideas for this presentation came from working with Ilse. There's a picture of her in the bottom right of my slide. What I'll be doing is talking about butterfly gardening, a little more detail about choosing the plants, thinking about host plants and nectar plants for butterflies in general, moving a little bit beyond monarchs. Give you an example of a butterfly garden that we created when I was at the University of Minnesota, and then end talking about using the garden for citizen science. There are lots and lots of ways you can use a garden with students, but I decided in 20 minutes I was just going to talk about one, and that's citizen science. So thinking about the plants that you want to put in your garden, I'm going to put a big plug, no pun intended, after Chip's talk about plugs for using native plants versus exotic plants. So my first couple slides will focus on this. In general, when you put native plants into a garden, you need a lot less care, less fertilizer, less watering, less pesticides. And if they're native to your region, they're adapted to your climate and your soils. So that means that if something doesn't work, maybe it just doesn't belong in your soil. So you can kind of take a couple years to experiment and see what works. But generally, you're going to do better with native plants. The root structures of native plants, especially plants in a prairie, so if you're planting a garden, you can kind of think you're creating a miniature prairie. These plants will do a lot of good things for you. They'll anchor and improve the soil. So even if you move away and you're a teacher and you leave the school and they don't maintain the garden, or like me, you move away from the house where you had a big prairie garden for a lot of years, even if the people after you don't keep the garden up, you will have done some good for the soil because all the roots from those plants will have gone into the soil and made it better. You'll be preventing runoff, replenishing the groundwater, and sequestering carbon. So a prairie garden is doing a lot of great things besides just providing habitat for butterflies. The other thing about native plants, and here we're getting to the benefits for insects, is they support a greater number and species diversity of insects than exotic plants. So you'll be preserving biodiversity. And in a lot of cases, there are cultivars of native plants available. So these are plants that still have the same name as a native plant, but they've been bred for humans to have characteristics that we as humans might find interesting or attractive. But these are often not attractive to the insects, and they might not even be recognized by the insects. So here on the bottom, we have brown-eyed Susan, and the one on the left is one that's the native plant, and it hasn't been bred for human attractiveness. And the butterfly looks at that and knows what it is and knows that that's a source of nectar. And the one on the right is just going to look weird to a butterfly, and it might say, "What the heck is this?" So just a little, I know that probably if you're listening to this webinar, you probably already know that insects are really important. But if you're talking to other people about gardening for insects and they don't really understand why you're doing that, you can say things that make them realize the importance of insects. So if we're gardening for insects, we're creating habitat for the organisms that will pollinate a lot of flowering plants, and that assures seed production and food for many species, including us as humans. And birds, we think of some birds as coming to our feeders and eating seed that we provide for them. But a lot of animals, especially birds, eat insects. And even these seed eaters almost exclusively feed insects to their young. So here we have a picture of an eastern bluebird. And on the right is an Anna's hummingbird. And hummingbirds create kind of a mixture of nectar and insects, kind of a gooey insect covered thing that they feed to their offspring. So here we have an Anna's hummingbird picture there. So when we're gardening for insects, we're gardening for a lot of other organisms that'll eat those insects. Getting to the essentials of a butterfly garden, basically you need to think of the host plants that the caterpillars will eat and the flowers that the adults will eat. So on the left, you see Joe Pye weed, and on the right, a milkweed that are both feeding insects in their different ways. And when you're thinking about what butterflies you would like to attract to your garden, you need to know what they eat. And some caterpillars are very fussy eaters, so you need to plant specific plants for them, and some caterpillars are generalists. So here we have a picture of a moonseed moth, which eats moonseed, that just one species. There are insects that are specific to families. So we have, for example, this black swallowtail, which eats plants in the carrot family. So this is the upper right-hand picture there. And if people know that you're interested in monarchs, you're going to get a lot of questions from people about black swallowtails eating their parsley or their dill or the tops of their carrots. And you can just say, no, that's a black swallowtail, because people look at a caterpillar and they think black and yellow stripes, and immediately think monarchs, but you'll sound smart if you know that's not a monarch. There are species like monarchs that are genus specific. So as Chip said, they'll eat almost anything in the genus Asclepias, so the bottom left picture. And then some that are generalists, like I think that's a Luna moth right there, but I might be wrong about that. It's not a Cecropia. So this is an example of a generalist, the tiger swallowtail. You see a lot of tiger swallowtails around. These are generalists that eat trees, lots and lots of tree species. You can see the adult butterflies in the bottom right-hand picture there. Sometimes the females are black in this species and sometimes they're yellow. And you can see the caterpillars on the top and the pupa in the middle on the bottom. But this is an example why we really need to think broadly when we're using pesticides like Amanda talked about. So there are these tiger swallowtail caterpillars will eat ash trees. And if we're giving systemic treatments to prevent emerald ash borers, those systemic treatments are going into the leaves and will kill the caterpillars of these species if they eat ash trees. So we really need to think about our use of pesticides and the non-target potential impacts. Here's the viceroy. It looks like a monarch. You can see in the right-hand picture. Viceroy caterpillars look nothing like monarchs, and they eat willow plants when they're caterpillars. So there you can see them, the caterpillars and the butterfly of the viceroy. The red admiral is a really great butterfly, and I encourage you, even though it's not that fun to have nettles in your garden, just to find a little place in the back where you're not going to walk very often and put in some nettle plants, because you'll almost certainly get red admirals coming in. They're beautiful butterflies. The caterpillars are lots of fun to watch because the caterpillars curl up the leaf, like the leaf in the bottom middle is curled up, and there's a red admiral caterpillar eating inside there when they're little. So it's just like finding a little present to find these red admiral caterpillars on the nettle. You have to be super careful when you open it so you don't get stung by the nettles. And the upper left-hand picture next to the pin, the little green thing, next to the pin in that picture is a red admiral egg, which is also a nice prize to find on your nettle plants. That was the host plants for the caterpillars. Now we're going to think about adult food. So adults stop being able to chew, and they use capillary action to get nectar into their bodies. So you can see on this monarch head the coiled up proboscis, which it'll insert that into nectar, and that'll come into its stomach and provide it nutrition. Almost all butterflies and moths eat like this, but some don't. So you can see the Cecropia on the top. That moth actually doesn't have mouth parts. It doesn't eat as an adult, so it has to get all of its nutrients from the time that it's a caterpillar. But the two butterflies here are both able to eat as adults. So when you're thinking about nectar plants, you want to make sure that you have nectar plants that are available throughout the season, because there will be bees and butterflies that are using your plants from spring through fall, depending on where you are in the country. We don't know where all of you are, but you're probably all over. So some of you might need nectar plants in the winter. We definitely don't in Wisconsin. But you can see here some of the good spring blooming plants, the golden Alexander, the lupin plant there. Those are great nectar sources in the springtime. And then just a few examples here. The milkweeds are great, as Chip said, for a lot of different species of butterflies. And here we have a couple examples here. The whorled milkweed on the left with a Karner blue butterfly on it. I took that picture in central Wisconsin. That's an endangered species. Monarch on common milkweed, some skippers on swamp milkweed, again, the viceroy on butterfly weed. So these are great nectar sources for lots and lots of butterflies and bees. With the blazing stars, Chip also mentioned these are great. They're just like butterfly magnets for monarchs in the fall. So here you can see a monarch that used to be my yard when I lived in Minnesota. A silver-spotted skipper. If you like to impress people that you know some skippers, the silver-spotted skipper is a great one to learn because it's really distinguishable by that big silver spot on its hind wing. And just a few more examples. The blue vervain, black-eyed Susan, you already saw a picture of that. The pearl crescent is a great butterfly. Tiger swallowtails on ironweed. The asters, Chip mentioned these two. The asters are good fall flowering plants. So here you see a black swallowtail and a red admiral and a monarch, all on different species of asters. So one thing to think about is you really want to consider the life cycle of the species that you're working with and make sure that you have the plants available when the butterflies need them. So for monarchs, for example, this circle represents the annual cycle of monarchs. And if we start where we are in the spring, on the right side of this picture, in the springtime, as the monarchs are moving north, as they will soon, they're leaving the overwintering sites as we speak, moving through northern Canada into the southern United States. And as they move up here, they'll need the milkweed plants and the nectar plants. During the summer, they need the same thing, milkweed plants and nectar plants. As they're going south in the fall, they need more sources of nectar, and then they need safe spots for their overwintering time. So basically, you need to think about the right place and the right time and the right plants. And that would be true for any of the species that you're thinking about. Another example of creating a garden, this is a garden that we created at the University of Minnesota. It was our Monarch lab. We called it a community garden. And I want to just talk a little bit here. So you need to prepare the soil, and we talked about that, bring in the plugs. And I just wanted to mention, Chip mentioned the importance of mulch, and you can see here that we're putting a lot of mulch onto our garden. But I have just moved to Wisconsin, where we have a big problem with jumping worms, invasive earthworms that are called jumping worms. And it turns out that we've done a study at the Arboretum, and places with mulch are much more likely to harbor jumping worms. So if you're in a part of the country where or basically anywhere in Wisconsin, consider using something other than mulch, than wood mulch, because that's the most attractive to earthworms. So think about other issues with your garden when you're creating the garden. It's great to plant a garden with kids. We had a lot of kids from local schools come to work with us. And I wanted to point out two things here. If you are working with kids, the left-hand picture that has the right arrow or the orange arrow to remind me to say this, it's good to have a lot of adults working with the kids when you're planting a garden. And the other thing that we found is some of the kids really don't like to get their hands dirty. So the girl on the right, you can see that we've given her gloves that she's wearing, and she was much more comfortable doing this planting when she had gloves on her hands. But not all the kids. You can see the ones on the bottom middle don't need gloves. And we're very clear with that top arrow on the right-hand picture to tell the kids where to put the plants. We actually did have some planted in the middle of what we were going to have as paths, but they all had a lot of fun doing it. It's also good when you're planting a garden to make sure that you have plants that are there the first year. So you want to have stuff that comes up, because otherwise, like Chip said, people get a little nervous when they don't see anything coming up. So this was the first fall of our garden. And then this picture is what it looked like after that first fall. The white plant that you're seeing in the bottom right hand of this picture is whorled milkweed, which spread throughout really nicely. I also wanted to mention one thing that Chip talked about removing the dead stalks. Some of the research that we and our colleagues at the University of Minnesota did in this garden showed that there were a lot of native bees that nested in stalks, that overwintered in plant stalks during the winter. So once we did that research and found that out, we stopped removing the dead stalks until we were starting to see native bees, because a lot of bees nest in stalks. So if you remove all of those stalks in the winter or too early in the spring and pile them up, you might be killing some of those native species of bees that nest in stalks. So that's something that we learned because we were doing research in this garden and had colleagues that were studying bees. So now I'm going to end just talking really quickly about what you can do in a garden. And one of the things that we've really stressed in all our work with kids and with teachers is doing citizen science and engaging students in real science. So citizen science, as probably most of you know, is the way to engage the public in inquiry and also in the discovery of new scientific knowledge. So I still get to do a little bit of work with students. That's me out in a big prairie with some high school students last summer, and we're doing the monarch larva monitoring project. So I'm just going to mention very briefly some citizen science projects that are focused on monarchs, and there are lots of them. There are dozens of projects of citizen science, or even hundreds, that you could do in a garden. But since we're focusing on monarchs here, I'm going to just list on this slide what we call the Big Five monarch citizen science projects, the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project and Journey North. I'm going to talk in more detail about those. That's why they're bolded here. They started in 1996 and 1994, but you can also do Monarch Health, which started 14 years ago. I have the number of kind of giving you an idea of the magnitude of these projects. So Monarch Health had over 10,000 samples in 2018 from 207 different volunteers. Chip talked a little bit about Monarch Watch, the tagging program. That was started in 1992, so the longest running of these Big Five citizen science projects, putting tags on monarchs. They had 146,000. Chip, I think that number is wrong here. I think that's low. But Chip can't talk now, so when I look at that, it seems low. Tagged in 2017. The other place that we get a lot of data on monarchs is from the North American Butterfly Association. I didn't bold that because unless you're really excited about butterflies, it might be hard for you to teach students how to recognize all the different species of butterflies. So I'm just focusing on the monarch ones here. So just a few slides about two of those. The Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, here you can see the location of MLMP sites, and this is the website listed up here, mlmp.org. Looks kind of similar to the map that Chip showed you, places where people are getting the milkweed plants from his program. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap in those sites, and you can see there's a big concentration of them around the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul in Minnesota, because that's where the Monarch Lab was, where we started this project, but they're all over the country. And basically with this project, all you need to do is find monarch eggs and larvae. You just need to go out into that garden that you've created and put milkweed into, find the monarch eggs and larvae, count them. And I wanted to just say a couple words about Journey North. There's a website up there, journeynorth.org. That program was founded in 1994 by Elizabeth Howard, and you can see a picture of her. The bottom picture, that's Elizabeth on the left and me on the right. That program moved to the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum last year. So it's been going 25 years, and it's starting its second 25 years here. And this program tracks migrations and seasons of many species besides just monarchs, birds, insects, worms, frogs, lots of other things. But I'm going to show you what we're learning about monarchs. So with this program, it's very easy. Basically, you just see a monarch and you report it online. And each of these dots represent the first butterfly that was seen by a person in all of the different weeks on the list over here. So as the colors get more red, the dates are getting later and the butterflies are moving further north. So you can see the colors getting darker, and we can track the migration every spring. And people also send pictures of the monarchs that you see. So each of these dots that have a white dot in the middle of it is associated with a picture. So here you can see a picture that somebody named Carol from Fayetteville, New York took. So it's really fun to kind of look at these and think of the people seeing their monarchs and taking a picture of them and posting it online. Journey North also tracks the migration southward. So here we have kind of a reverse of the dots on the map that we saw before. Each of these represents people seeing the peak of the migration moving through their area. And again, the dots represent pictures. So this was a picture taken by John in Madison, Wisconsin. We had so many monarchs moving through Madison in the fall of 2019, and a lot of people snap pictures, and you can find a lot of great pictures there. episode. You just see monarchs and report them online. It's very easy. It's something that kids can do in a garden. Basically, my message, and I think all of our message here, is that you should plant gardens. You should find the right species for your area. You should find species that include both nectar plants and host plants for monarchs and a lot of other butterflies. And if you want a certain kind of butterfly, you plant the host plant for that butterfly. You plant it, you take care of it, and you use it with kids. So that is it for me. And I'll turn it over to Marcia, I think.
I'd like to thank Doctors Chip Taylor, Karen Oberhauser, and Amanda Pierce for sharing their extensive knowledge of monarch butterflies with us. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to your participation in future IPM webinars. Have a great day.